Here's something you probably don't hear every day. Jamaica, the land of reggae, sprinting legends, and golden beaches, was once known internationally not for its culture or its beauty, but for its economic disaster. There was a time, not very long ago, when Jamaica was ranked among the worst-managed economies in the world. Debt piled so high it felt like the country was drowning. Inflation made life unpredictable, chewing through savings like a fire racing through dry grass. Growth? Practically non-existent. For decades, global institutions used Jamaica as the ultimate warning sign, a live demonstration of what not to do if you wanted your economy to survive. And right at the center of this story was the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. For years, Jamaica was its most difficult patient, returning again and again for bailouts. Every few years, the cycle repeated. Crisis, IMF loan, austerity, disappointment. To ordinary Jamaicans, the IMF wasn't seen as a friend. It was viewed as a doctor prescribing bitter medicine that never healed, only prolonged the pain. Fast forward to the present, and the story has been rewritten in a way nobody expected. Jamaica, the same island once mocked as hopeless, has now been transformed into the IMF's star student. Global economists point to Jamaica as an example of fiscal discipline, reform, and resilience. The turnaround has been so impressive that in 2024, the IMF itself hired Jamaica's finance minister, Dr. Nigel Clark, as one of its deputy managing directors. Imagine that. The very country once seen as a basket case now provides leadership to the very institution that once dictated its future. So, what exactly happened here? How did Jamaica escape its cycle of crisis? What reforms really changed the story? And perhaps most importantly, does this turnaround mean life is genuinely better for Jamaicans on the ground, or is it mainly a polished success story told for global audiences? Let's break it all down. And before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe, because here we go beyond the numbers to uncover the human stories shaping global economics. To understand why the IMF now sings Jamaica's praises, we first need to understand how bad things once were. For decades, Jamaica was stuck in what economists call a debt trap. The script was painfully predictable. The government would overspend and borrow heavily. Debt would rise. Interest payments would swallow a bigger and bigger share of the budget. Eventually, the government couldn't keep up, and the IMF would be called in for another bailout. Rinse and repeat. By the early 2010s, the situation had reached breaking point. Jamaica's debt had ballooned to over 140% of GDP. To put that in perspective, if the country earned $1, it owed $1.40. It wasn't just high, it was among the highest in the world. Jamaica's debt-to-GDP ratio sat alongside that of crisis-hit countries like Greece during its European debt meltdown. Inflation was another nightmare. Prices would rise unpredictably, making it almost impossible for families to plan or save. One month's paycheck might cover groceries, but the next month, food and transport would cost so much more that people had to cut corners. Growth was sluggish at best, sometimes crawling at less than 1% annually. Imagine trying to build wealth or opportunity in a system where the economy barely moves. It was suffocating. Unemployment, especially for young people, remained stubbornly high. Fresh graduates entered the job market only to find dead ends. Many left Jamaica entirely, joining the diaspora in the United States, Canada, and the UK, where opportunities seemed brighter. Those who stayed often struggled to get by in a system where the promise of upward mobility fell out of reach. Outside observers saw Jamaica as a cautionary tale. Economists used it in lectures and reports as an example of what happens when fiscal discipline is absent and political leaders fail to manage spending. Inside the country, frustration grew deeper. Ordinary citizens associated the IMF with austerity, hardship, and broken promises. Programs meant to save the economy usually came with wage freezes, higher taxes, and cuts to social services. Parents worried about paying school fees. Nurses and teachers saw stagnant paychecks, even as their workloads grew. The acronym IMF became almost a curse word. Jamaica wasn't just facing numbers on a spreadsheet. It was facing the human toll of decades of economic mismanagement and dependency. And by the early 2010s, it was clear something had to change. Then came 2013, a year that would become the turning point. Jamaica once again signed on to an IMF program. At first glance, it looked like business as usual. More conditions, more promises, more international supervision. Ordinary Jamaicans sighed, expecting the same cycle to repeat itself. But this time, something unexpected happened. Unlike previous governments that had approached IMF agreements reluctantly, Jamaica's leaders decided to embrace the reforms with an unusual seriousness. Instead of treating the program as temporary, they embedded key reforms into law. They created strict fiscal rules that acted like guardrails. These rules capped how much the government could spend, forcing discipline in the budget. They also laid out clear debt reduction targets, ensuring progress wasn't optional but legally required. Several reforms stood out. First, tax reform. Jamaica's system had been weak, riddled with loopholes and inefficiencies. Reform widened the tax base, improved compliance, and modernized the way revenue was collected. For once, money owed to the government actually reached the government. Second, public sector wage controls. For years, salaries for government employees had consumed the lion's share of the budget. Reforms aimed to freeze or slow this growth. It wasn't popular. Imagine telling thousands of workers that their paychecks would barely move for years, but it was necessary to create breathing room. Third, central bank independence. Perhaps the boldest move of all. Historically, the Bank of Jamaica had been influenced by political cycles. Short-term decisions often undermined long-term stability. Reform changed this, giving the central bank autonomy and a clear mandate: keep inflation low and stable. This was critical for restoring confidence in Jamaica's currency. And finally, transparency. Jamaica created the Economic Program Oversight Committee, EPOC, an innovation unlike anything seen in previous IMF programs. This committee wasn't filled only with politicians. It included business leaders, trade unions, and civil society representatives. Every month, EPIC updated the public on whether targets were being met. For the first time, Jamaicans could see in real time whether their government was sticking to its promises. This move was revolutionary. It turned the IMF program from something secretive and imposed into something participatory and visible. It gave citizens a sense that the reforms weren't just foreign dictates, they were national commitments. Of course, these changes didn't come without pain. The early years after 2013 were some of the toughest. Families tightened their belts. Government workers endured wage freezes. Public services stretched thin under constrained budgets. Hospitals, schools, and infrastructure projects often ran on fumes. Many Jamaicans questioned whether the sacrifice was worth it. But slowly, the results began to appear. Debt, once a suffocating mountain, started to come down. From its peak at over 140% of GDP, it steadily fell, reaching around 78% by 2022. That's almost having the debt burden in less than a decade. An extraordinary achievement. The government's budget, once plagued by deficits, began to stabilize. In fact, in some years, Jamaica even recorded surpluses, something almost unthinkable during the crisis years. Foreign reserves, which had once been dangerously low, were rebuilt, giving the country a cushion against shocks like hurricanes or global recessions. International credit rating agencies took notice. Jamaica's ratings improved, lowering the cost of borrowing and signaling to investors that the island was no longer a high-risk gamble. Inflation, once unpredictable, was brought under control and kept within the central bank's target range. The Jamaican dollar, long a source of worry, stabilized. Perhaps most importantly, investor confidence returned. Tourism boomed as always, but new investments also flowed into infrastructure, renewable energy, and logistics. Jamaica was no longer just a place where investors saw risk. It became a place where they saw opportunity. In other words, the numbers were finally moving in the right direction. The textbook reforms were producing textbook results. But perhaps the most surprising part of Jamaica's story is not the reforms themselves, but the politics that surrounded them. Normally, IMF programs collapse the moment a new government is elected. Why? Because austerity is unpopular. Wage freezes, spending cuts, tax hikes, these are not things that win elections. Yet in Jamaica, something rare happened. Successive governments, regardless of party, stayed the course. Both the People's National Party, PNP, and the Jamaica Labour Party, JLP, upheld the fiscal rules, respected the independence of the central bank, and kept pushing down debt. This continuity stunned international observers. Jamaica had done something few countries ever manage. It turned short-term reforms into long-term national policy. For investors, this signaled stability. For the IMF, it was a dream come true. Finally, a country where painful reforms weren't abandoned at the first sign of political risk. This political maturity became part of the story the IMF now tells proudly. Jamaica has proof that discipline and persistence can survive election cycles. And that's where Jamaica's story began to shift from being just about numbers to being about symbolism. So by the mid-2010s into the early 2020s, Jamaica had gone from a cautionary tale to a model case. It cut its debt nearly in half, stabilized its economy, and won back investor confidence. For the IMF, it became the star student, the one country they could point to when critics said their programs never worked. But here's the question. Does this success story on paper really reflect success for Jamaicans on the ground? Because numbers don't always tell the full human story. By the time the 2020s began, the IMF was facing a storm of criticism unlike anything it had seen in decades. Across continents, its name had become synonymous with austerity, broken promises, and painful sacrifices that rarely seemed to deliver prosperity. From Argentina to Ghana, from Greece to Pakistan, you could hear the same refrain. IMF programs were designed to protect creditors, not people. Entire populations felt trapped in cycles of bailouts that solved nothing. For the IMF, this was not just bad press. It was an existential threat. The organization lives and dies by its credibility. If country after country begins to see it as an agent of misery rather than stability, then its influence weakens. And so, the IMF desperately needed a success story. It needed proof that its medicine could work if taken properly. That's where Jamaica became more than just another small Caribbean nation. Jamaica became the IMF's best defense. When activists in Latin America claimed IMF programs never succeed, officials would point to Jamaica. When critics in Africa said austerity destroys societies, the IMF would pull out charts showing Jamaica's falling debt, controlled inflation, and renewed investor confidence. When economists in Europe accused the fund of creating dependency, Jamaica became the shining counterexample. The story crystallized in 2024 when Dr. Nigel Clark, Jamaica's own finance minister, was appointed as one of the IMF's deputy managing directors. This wasn't just about his resume. It was symbolic. Clark represented not only himself, but Jamaica's entire journey, from IMF's most difficult patient to its most celebrated graduate. His appointment sent a message. Jamaica wasn't just following IMF rules. It was now helping to write them. For the IMF, this was gold. It transformed Jamaica from a local turnaround story into a global brand, a case study used in speeches, reports, and policy briefings around the world. Jamaica wasn't just a country anymore, it was a narrative weapon. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because while Jamaica ticked all the boxes of IMF success, lower debt, stable inflation, stronger reserves, the lived reality for ordinary Jamaicans hasn't always matched the glowing reports. Let's start with growth. Yes, the economy grew, but the pace was modest, averaging around 1% to 2% annually for much of the past decade. In a country with deep inequality and high social needs, that rate of growth isn't transformative. It doesn't create enough jobs to absorb thousands of young people graduating each year. It doesn't generate the kind of momentum needed to upgrade schools, hospitals, or infrastructure at the speed citizens hope for. Then there's inequality. Wealthy Jamaicans and investors, both local and foreign, benefited from stability. For them, lower interest rates, better credit ratings, and a stronger investment climate meant more opportunities. But for the middle and working classes, the benefits often felt distant. Wage freezes meant that government workers, teachers, nurses, police officers went years with little to no salary increases, even as the cost of living rose steadily. Social programs also felt the squeeze. Fiscal discipline left limited room for ambitious investments in education, healthcare, or social safety nets. Many schools continued to operate without enough resources. Hospitals faced staff shortages and outdated facilities. Families still worried about paying tuition, covering medical bills, or repairing roads in rural areas. This created a paradox. Jamaica had achieved stability on paper, but many citizens asked, stability for whom? Investors and international creditors were reassured, yes. But the everyday Jamaican family often felt that they had borne the brunt of the sacrifice without reaping proportional rewards. To really understand this disconnect, let's step into the shoes of ordinary Jamaicans. Imagine a nurse in Kingston in the mid-2010s. Her salary is frozen as part of the public sector wage restraint. Every day, she works long hours in an underfunded hospital. Supplies run short. The patient load is heavy. Meanwhile, groceries get more expensive, transportation costs rise, and rent increases. She's told the country is recovering, that Jamaica is the IMF success story. But for her, recovery means tightening her belt and stretching her paycheck thinner. Or think of a teacher in Montego Bay. Year after year, she hears about budget surpluses and falling debt ratios. But in her classroom, she struggles with overcrowded conditions, outdated textbooks, and students who can't afford lunch. For her, stability doesn't look like opportunity. It looks like more responsibility with fewer resources. Now, picture a young graduate in Spanish Town. He's armed with a degree, full of ambition, but job prospects are scarce. He sees headlines celebrating investor confidence and IMF praise. But his reality is unemployment or perhaps a low-paying job in the informal sector. Eventually, he looks abroad, joining the wave of Jamaicans migrating in search of better chances. For him, stability is just a buzzword, not a paycheck. And consider the small farmer in St. Elizabeth. His crops depend on outdated irrigation systems. Roads to market are poor. Credit is expensive and hard to access. He hears about Jamaica's rising foreign reserves, but what he really needs is investment in agriculture infrastructure. For him, the macro success story feels like a story told about someone else's life. These snapshots show the human side of the reforms. They remind us that while debt ratios and inflation targets matter, what ultimately counts is how people live, work, and dream. So why, given these challenges, does the IMF still hold Jamaica up as its favorite example? The answer lies in what Jamaica represents, not just what it achieved. For the IMF, Jamaica proves three things. First, it proves that painful reforms can work, at least in the narrow sense of stabilizing finances. Second, it proves that political consensus can hold, since both major Jamaican parties stuck to the same plan despite elections. And third, it proves that small, vulnerable economies can be disciplined enough to restore international confidence. In short, Jamaica became the counterweight to decades of IMF criticism. Whenever someone argues that IMF programs trap countries in debt, officials can say, "Look at Jamaica. It halved its debt in less than a decade." Whenever skeptics complain that politics always derails reform, the IMF responds, "Not in Jamaica. Their reforms survived multiple governments." The fact that Jamaica is small actually strengthens its symbolism. It's easier for the IMF to say, if a small, disaster-prone island can do it, then so can you. Jamaica became less about Jamaica itself and more about what it represented for the IMF's global narrative. But here's the truth. Jamaica's journey is far from over. Yes, the country deserves recognition for its discipline and resilience. Cutting debt nearly in half is no small feat. Stabilizing inflation and building reserves are genuine achievements. Politicians who carried these reforms forward despite the risks, showed unusual commitment. Yet the real challenge now is moving beyond stability to prosperity. Stability is the foundation, but prosperity is the house. Jamaicans want growth that doesn't just show up in reports, but shows up in their daily lives. They want schools with better resources, hospitals that can serve communities properly, roads and infrastructure that connect rural areas to markets. They want jobs that keep young people at home rather than pushing them to migrate. The next phase of Jamaica's story must be about inclusive growth, about making sure that the sacrifices of austerity are not wasted, but transformed into opportunities. Because if people don't feel the benefits in their households, the success story risks becoming hollow. This is where the Jamaican government faces a delicate balance. On one hand, it must maintain fiscal discipline to keep debt under control. On the other hand, it must find creative ways to invest in its people through education, healthcare, and innovation. It's not an easy balance, but it's the only way to turn stability into real prosperity. Jamaica's story carries lessons not just for itself, but for the world. For one, it shows the importance of transparency and accountability. The creation of the Economic Program Oversight Committee was groundbreaking. By involving business, unions, and civil society, Jamaica turned reforms into something monitored and debated openly. That sense of ownership helped build trust. It also shows the power of political continuity. Too often, reforms collapse when governments change. But Jamaica showed that with enough national consensus, painful measures can survive elections. This doesn't mean democracy was sidelined. Far from it. It means that parties across the spectrum recognized the danger of returning to old habits and chose to stay the course. At the same time, Jamaica's experience warns us that macroeconomic success does not automatically equal human development. Stability is necessary, but it's not sufficient. Without targeted investment in people, success risks being celebrated abroad while frustration simmers at home. For other countries negotiating with the IMF today, Jamaica is both inspiration and lesson for them.